All right. Good morning, everyone. We have day 262 of the project. Here we are making our way through H.G. Wells's outline of history today, continuing with the American Revolution. We'll get our appropriate bubble up here. As you can see, as the weeks wear on, I'm getting more comfortable with the different levers and pulleys on this site. And one day I'll have them all down pat. All right, but here we are. We're going to have an announcement concerning ApocatastasisInstitute, and then get into a poem, Paul Revere's Ride, most appropriately, and then get into at least some highlights of the American Revolution. So to do all of that, we're going to need our screen share. So I'll get that queued up and we'll be right as rain. So ApocatastasisInstitute is an alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. We focus principally on the Western humanities. And what makes us unique in the truest, unique, exclusive sense of that word, one of a kind, is the proper definition of unique. What makes apocatastasis unique is the teaching of the humanities, history, literature, philosophy, languages, in sync with each other. You do not get this anywhere else. Additionally, something that's very important for us is what we call relational education. That is to say, students and staff, the same students and staff, studying together for extended periods of time. That is to say, not for a quarter or a semester, but for, as we say with our 3-year course of study, for 3 years. And you really don't, as a teacher nearly of 20 years myself, you do not see any serious intellectual growth until you've been with a student at least 2 full years. Only after that, in your 3rd year, do you really make progress. Isn't it interesting? Modern pedagogy, whether that's public school, private school, grade school, tertiary school, homeschool. Isn't it interesting? In all of these modern things which dare call themselves education, that the relationship with the instructor is severed routinely, certainly long before 2 years have gone over. Very interesting, almost like there's a plan at hand. Anyway, here is our screen share, and here is our grand website. And there's so much going on at the Institute between myself and the staff, the students, and so forth are visiting speakers. And one of those is going to be up next month, and that's Janice Barcello. And she's going to be speaking on the hidden causes of autism, what the medical establishment will never tell you, and what we can do now to end this epidemic. And you can see the write-up. There's a picture of Janice herself, and the specifics of the event in the middle of June, the hidden causes of autism. So that is our announcement for this installment of the project, day 262 of 365. And the purpose of putting out this series is indeed to give you a feel of what it's like to enroll at the Institute. Without further ado, we're going to move into our poetry section of this broadcast, live broadcast, thanks to your donations. And appropriately, this is Paul Revere's Ride, and this is put out by the Paul Revere House. You know, one of the scholars I studied under in Danbury, in fact, worked in the Paul Revere House. That was her claim to fame, I recall. She was a tour guide at the Paul Revere House and on the Freedom Trail through Boston. I once found myself in a car in that old part of Boston and had to leave. I was looking for the Freedom Trail, in fact, and had to leave because I figured, and I think with great intelligence, that I was going to run somebody over. The streets were so narrow, and people this Saturday afternoon were just milling around. They weren't heedful at all of the automobiles, and I said, I have to get out of here. I'm going to hit somebody if I don't retreat. So there's the Paul Revere Ride, there's the Paul Revere House picture. And here's the poem, Paul Revere's Ride, written by Longfellow. You can see him on the right there. Boston poet, Concord poet, one or the other. I'd have to say Boston. I believe he lived in Boston, but he knew a lot of those guys out in Concord at the time. Anyway, Paul Revere's ride. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere of the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friends as the British march, be land besieged in the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. If one if be land and two if be sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, all ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, from the country folk to be up and into arm. Then he said good night, and with a muffled oar silently rowed to the Charlestown shore. Just as the moon rose o'er the bay, where swinging wide at the moorings lay the Somerset British man of war, the phantom ship, each mast a spar, across the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hulk that was magnified be its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile, his friend through alley and street wanders and watches with eager ears, till in the silence round him hears the muster of men at the barrack door, the sound of arms, the tramp of feet, and the measured treads of grenadiers marching down to the boats on the shore. Then he climbed to the tower of the old North Church, be the wooden stairs with stealthy tread, to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch, and the sombre rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes of shade. Be the trembling ladder, steep and tall, to the highest window in the wall, where he paused to listen and look down a moment on the roofs of the town, and the moonlight flowing over all. Beneath the churchyard lay the dead in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear like a sentinel's tread the watchful night wind as it went, creeping along from tent to tent, seeming to whisper, all is well. A moment only he feels the spell of the place and the hour and the secret dread of the lonely belfry and the dead. For suddenly all his thoughts are bent on the shadowy something far away, where the river widens to meet the bay, on a line of black that bends and floats on the rising tide like a bridge of boats. And we'll leave it there. It is a longer poem, and that's one of the difficulties as I come up shortly with our 4-week courses of poetry in the project, like the illustration here, by the way, is how to deal with longer poems, which are unrealistic, of course, to read in one sitting, or to read in one sitting with some other readings assumed. I think the solution will be an appendix, so that we'll include in the 4-week cycle of 260 odd poems, just the incipits of the longer poems, and then who wants to can go and read the full poem as time and interest allow. Seems to be a helpful workaround. So yeah, there's an image of Paul Revere, and then here's another one, looks like from a type of comic book. I'm afraid this poem was once much more well-known than it is today. Here's a postage stamp with Longfellow, and once again, Revere in the background. So we can see the power of this image, the mythology of the Paul Revere image. Now, as historians, we know that mythology does not necessarily mean a made-up story. A myth for a historian may or may not have historically been true. Here's another image. We'll see what other ones this website holds. What makes a myth is that the story has influence for a specific group of people. So, for instance, to an earlier portrait that we had in the introduction here, here's Washington crossing the Delaware. And this certainly is a myth. Not that Washington, by all accounts, did not cross the Delaware, but rather, whether it's Washington or Revere, that these images say something to the American soul, psyche, and culture. When it comes to Paul Revere, I think the mythology is obvious, right? The do-it-yourselfer, the man of his community, warning everyone else about the redcoats coming. Kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like the Minutemen. Who is he calling? He's calling the Minutemen. right? Do-it-yourself soldiers. And so all of that plays, of course, into the American psychology and self-image, shall we say. And a great little poem. How does it finish? Everyone used to know these words. I used to know these words. So through the night rode Paul Revere, so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness and knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore, for born in the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last. In the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. That's interesting. So what rhyming pattern do we have? So A, B, B. Okay, I got it. So A, B, B, A, door. No, it doesn't work. Door, need, revere. Revere and fear rhyme. Alarm and farm rhyme. So A, B, B, A works. Then you have A, more. Okay, then you have A, B, or rather A, A, B, B. So A, B, B, A, then A, A, B, B. Then A, B, B, C. Unless somehow this rhymes with the first line, but you can't rhyme revere with revere. Anyway, a fine poem, interesting construction. And with that, let's change the camera and we will listen to our selection from H.G. Wells. Now, the project, as I've alluded to, has sections of poetry and sections of reading. So basically, 3 poems, a reading from H.G. Wells, outline of history, and then 3 more poems and a reading from the Durant Story of Civilization series. The first reading will be over a 1-year cycle, the second over a 3-year cycle, and then a third reading, which will be appropriate to either the first or the second reading, which will be an explanation of poetry or prose or play, some sort of literary meditation on the day's selection. So right now we just have the first reading and parts of the poetry together, but it's enough to do these grand broadcasts. So yesterday we talked about the French and Indian War and its influence on the colonies. In the big picture, we plugged in all of those events in the 1760s and 70s, the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, in fact, with the English Civil War. It's not for nothing that the movement for republicanism and self-rule originates in Puritan New England. It was the Puritans, after all, who toppled and executed the king 100 years before. And so we want to see these connections. Certainly, if you were a colonist, especially a northern colonist, you would very much have the English Civil War knocking about in your head from your grandpappy's stories. And indeed, as we learned yesterday, philosophers like John Locke had relations who fought with Cromwell's Roundheads. In addition, we had mentioned the question of what would have happened if the French had won the French and Indian War. You would have a completely different psychology to the center of North America. Whether or not it would have developed to be called America even remains a what if. But you would have had a completely different psychology. Now, finally, well, two things finally. You had, directly stemming from the French and Indian War, Wells told us 3 dangers that pressed on the colonists. One was somewhat moot. Those were the Indians. The Indians, which are complained about in the Declaration, don't really pose a tremendous threat by the 1770s to the colonists. And they've been shoved west and will be shoved west again and again until the late 19th century, alas. The American Indians never produced a Genghis Khan, although they did produce people like Pontiac and King Philip, who, if they weren't a Genghis Khan, were certainly jiving off of that energy. All right. So, and then additionally, you had the French annoyance that the colonists had, especially in New England. The French Catholics were given freedom of religion in Quebec after the French and Indian War. So, all of a sudden, if you're a paranoid Puritan, all of a sudden you have the Pope the Pope and his minions breathing down your back in Canada. And this is also, in addition to the Indians, is something that's complained about, although in roundabout ways, in the Declaration of Independence, which leaves the last threat and the last gripe that the colonists had between the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. And that was the Crown. Now, the Crown wanted to be paid back for its exertions in the Revolution, not altogether unrealistically. And it was this which gave rise to the cries for no taxation without representation and the flurry to repeal the Stamp Act, and so forth. So anyway, this whole time you have the revival of the militia system in New England, especially in Massachusetts. And long story short, it's a great drama. I of course, do not have time to get into a lot of the military stuff in one little class. I leave that to either a more in-depth study, which we do offer at the Institute. We have special classes. In fact, our special course, I'm talking a semester-long course on American history, the first part of that up until the Civil War is called We Hold These Truths. So it's a more in-depth survey of American history where we really would get into this sort of thing a lot more. But in any case, the militia around Boston had been storing up and squirreling away, as we say, munitions at Concord, which you can ascertain here in the upper left. Concord's a nice little town, little city nowadays. Great if you're a yuppie and have a dog that needs to be walked, and if you have a hankering for coffee, they have some good coffee and bagel shops there. The cemetery in Concord has various people, including Longfellow, buried up on Author's Ridge. I visited Author's Ridge up in that cemetery years ago. I was very happy to do that. The Alcotts, including Louisa May Alcott and Bronson Alcott, are up there. The Thoreaus are up there, as is Longfellow and some other fine skins as well. Anyway, back to the 18th century, you have the Minutemen, as they're called, squirreling away munitions up in Concord. And they're drilling on Sundays and on the weekends and whatever. They don't have a weekend in the 18th century, but you get the idea. And long story short, especially after the Boston Tea Party and a lot of as far as the British are concerned, the pouting that the colonists are putting on, the British General Gage orders his men to go up through this road here, which I believe is now one of the roads that leads into Boston. A lot of these old colonial roads are through roads now, paved. Gage orders his men to come up to Concord to get the weapons at nighttime. And this, of course, triggers basically a spy network which had been operative in Boston and would actually wormed its way into the circle of Gage, including his wife, Peggy Gage. A very interesting and somewhat heartbreaking story. Peggy Gage was working for the Minutemen, working for the Sons of Liberty, which is one of the organizing groups, which is a whole Freemasonic aspect to all of this, Sons of Liberty being one of these occulted groups. But in any case, Gage decides to cross over the Boston Neck, one if by land, two if by sea. And you can see in this map, it is a longer journey. And actually, if memory serves, I have to double check. I believe actually Gage used boats because you can see you can cut off a lot of time if you just get in the boats and cross. It's a little bit more of a hassle, but you save a lot of time having to go down and up. Anyway, it is nighttime, and the Minutemen, of whom Paul reveres, the most famous, but not the only one, are running up here, and they're running in other directions too, but they pretty much know the gauge is going for Concord because of their spies in Boston, so they don't have to really cast their net in every direction. And they bump into Minutemen on the Lexington Green. And there's an altercation at night. There was a tavern up there as well. You can imagine some drinking is going on. People get in their prides when they're in their cups, and shots are fired. They're disorganized, probably accidental. This is the shot that's heard around the world. And in any case, the resistance, so-called, very quickly dissolves, and the British continue their way to Concord, where they find several hours later the Minutemen have gathered on the bridge at Concord and have organized, and now they're not drunk ruffians in the middle of the night. Now at dawn, they are out in array. Yeah, they're militia, but they're definitely organized, and they're not going to let the redcoats take the ammunition. And so there is a skirmish, a brief skirmish, and then the British withdraw. And thus begins really the battles of Lexington and Concord. Up until now, you're just focusing on these initial shots, but the real battle is this heartbreaking retreat of the British from Concord through Lexington back to Boston. And by this point, the Minutemen in the woods have come out with their frying pans and their pitchforks and their grandpa's muskets and all sorts of things, and they're taking pop shots and throwing rocks and all of this guerrilla warfare that they picked up, probably some of them, during the French and Indian War. And it is in this retreat that most of the British soldiers are killed. Eventually, Gage's men get back to Boston, at which point Boston is put on a total lockdown in protest of what the Minutemen had done. And it is in the subsequent months that the Minutemen entrench at Bunker Hill, which you can kind of see here. There's also another one, Breed's Hill, nearby. And this provokes another battle. And in this instance, Boston is put on lockdown for several months until finally the British send a fleet and evacuate their soldiers up into Canada, from whence they will plan the real subsequent military campaign. Let's get some words here from H.G. Wells before we get into at least a very, very superficial look at the American Revolution militarily. Here's our LCN bookmark doing its due diligence, and we read from H.G. Wells. So the war began. It was not a war that promised a conclusive end. The colonists had no one valuable capital. They were dispersed over a great country with a limitless wilderness behind it. And so they had great powers of resistance. They had learned their tactics largely from the Indians. They could fight well in open order and harry and destroy troops like at Lexington and Concord. But they had no disciplined army that could meet the British in a pitched battle, and little military equipment. And their levies grew impatient at a long campaign and tended to go home to their farms. The British, on the other hand, had a well-drilled army, and their command of the sea, obviously that's the British forte there, right? It's the sea naval warfare. We're going to see that a lot with the Napoleonic Wars. That's where they put all their eggs into, that little basket there. Anyway, the sea power give them the power of shifting their attack up and down the long Atlantic seaboard. They were at peace with all the world. But the king was stupid and greedy to interfere in the conduct of affairs. The generals he favored were stupid strong men, are flighty men of birth and fashion. And the heart of England was not in the business. Very important. The heart of England was not in this war. The king trusted rather to being able to blockade, raid, and annoy the colonists into submission, rather than to a conclusive conquest and occupation of the land. You ask yourself, why are the British not in it? Why is their heart not in it? Why is the king not so committed to maintaining the American colonies? Because of India, frankly. Because of India and the attention in not just the continent of Europe, which is still the center stage of things, but also in the Orient when it comes to colonies. Like with the Romans, so with the British, their biggest colonies, but wealth-wise, were in the East. They were not in the West. But the methods the king employed, and particularly the use of hired German troops, Hessians, who still retained the cruel traditions of the 30 Years' War, and the Indian auxiliaries, who harried the outlying settlers, did not so much weary the Americans of the war as it wearied the British. The Congress, meeting for the second time in 1775 after Lexington and Concord, endorsed the action of the New England colonists and appointed George Washington, who showed up wearing his British military uniform, to give him a hint. Hey guys, I want the job. I want the job of being your Continental Army commander. And so he became the commander-in-chief of the same. In 1777, General Burgoyne, in an attempt to get down to New York from Canada, was defeated at Freeman's Farm on the Upper Hudson and surrounded and obliged to capitulate Saratoga with his whole army. Saratoga is a great battlefield up there. You can visit the park up there, as I have. Seemingly endless walking trails. Good for dogs. This disaster of Saratoga encouraged the French and the Spanish to come into the struggle on the side of the colonies. The French fleet, so now the colonists have a fleet to work with, courtesy of their new friends, the French. Remember, the French are pissed off at their defeat in the French and Indian War. So this is revenge. The American Revolution is revenge on the British in the same way that Afghanistan was revenge on the Soviets in the 1980s. So the French fleet did much to minimize the advantage of the British at sea. Notice that tomorrow, when we look at the French Revolution, their activity in America is going to be directly connected ideologically and also, in a negative way, financially, to what happened in America 10 years before. Right? A lot of those French soldiers who come over and fight with the Continental Army against the British, they're going to be hanging around with Americans who are talking about John Locke, who are talking about all of this Enlightenment philosophy about self-government and so forth. So they're going to bring those ideas home. They're also going to bring home a huge war debt. And that is also one of the things that sets the stage for the French Revolution. Still in all, General Cornwallis, British general, was caught at Yorktown Peninsula in Virginia in 1781 and capitulated with his army. The British government, now heavily engaged with France and Spain and Europe, was at the end of its resources. And I want to show you a map here, just to recapitulate, in fact, the military strategy of the American Revolution. So here we have an illustration of the East Coast of these nascent United States. Okay, so here's Canada. Here's everything over the Alleghenies, the eastern half of the Mississippi Valley. Not going to worry about that. Not going to worry about Canada. Here's the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, which I'm told is the Gulf of America these days. What we're focusing on here is indeed this strip of 13 colonies. And then, in a nutshell, the British strategy, and they are obviously much stronger, so it is they who are deciding strategy. Initially in the war, they retreat from Boston and head up to Newfoundland. And then when they come back, their first attempt is to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, cut off the head of the snake. And they do that by trying to go up the Hudson, which I don't suppose you're going to be able to see on your map here. But they go up the Hudson here, and this is where Burgoyne is stopped, as we read, at Saratoga. That causes the British to withdraw and reconsider, and then indeed gets the French on the side of the Americans, especially after Trenton. So you had the Trenton victory, and then in 77 you had Trenton and Christmas Eve or St. Stephen's Day of 1776, and then you have Saratoga the following year. So these are two major. Well, I mean, Trenton is more of a mythological victory, as I said. Saratoga is a real, legit victory, and the point is they're convincing enough to the French to get them on their side and to lend their aid. So the attempt to amputate the troublesome New England Puritan Roundhead Republican colonies fails. And then the next option in the second half of the war is to start in Georgia, South Carolina area. Georgia is pretty loyal, in fact. Start in the south, come up through Georgia, consolidate Georgia, and then move up through the colonies and roll up the colonies like a scroll. So the first attempt to cut off the head didn't work. So the second attempt, the second major offensive, is with General Cornwallis in the south to move up and to roll up and push up, to push the resistance back and to isolate them. So in either instance, the initial offensive or the second one, it's to isolate the rebellious colonies and to isolate the rebellious rebels. And the British are able to do this because of their naval acumen. Help as the French may try. Okay. At the outset of the war, we continue reading, and then I want to take a quick look at the Declaration of Independence. At the outset of the war, the colonists in general seem to have been as little disposed to repudiate monarchy and to claim complete independence as were the Hollanders in the opening phase of Philip II's persecutions and folly. War radicalizes people. And so whether it's the Dutch in the Low Countries during the Reformation or the Americans in the late 18th century or the Irish in the 20th century or the Syrians in the 21st century, war radicalizes people and things that were never considered before become possible. So at the beginning of the American Revolution, it was the most small, fanatical, an ostracized group of revolutionaries who wanted to repudiate monarchy. That is not what most of the American soldiers, militiamen, Continentals wanted. They wanted something like Canada ended up being. They wanted something in the Commonwealth, or what we would call the Commonwealth now. They wanted the king and the parliament to be at arm's length and to have internal government within the 13 colonies. Only a radical rump wanted to altogether repudiate monarchy. But war radicalizes people, and this becomes more and more the direction of things. The separatists were called radicals, and they were mostly extremely democratic, getting back to those Protestant, Calvinist, Republican roots, as we should say in England today. And their advanced views frightened many of the steadier and wealthier colonists, for whom class privileges and distinctions had considerable charm. But early in 1776, an able and persuasive Englishman, Thomas Paine, published a pamphlet at Philadelphia with the title Common Sense, which had an enormous effect on public opinion. Its voice of nature cries, "'Tis time to part," and so forth. But its effects were very great Common sense converted thousands to the necessity of total separation. The turnover of opinion, once it had begun, was rapid. Now, I would like to talk about this Declaration of Independence. Only in the summer of 1776 did Congress take the irrevocable step of declaring for separation. Famously, Benjamin Franklin says, after signing the document, "Gentlemen, we must stand together, must hang together, or we'll hang separately." The Declaration of Independence, another of those exemplary documents which it has been the peculiar service of the English to produce for mankind, was drawn up by Thomas Jefferson, who must have been all of 35, maybe. And after various amendments and modifications, it's going to be very important to the coming American system of government, is the ability to amend it and modify it. The Declaration was made the fundamental document of the nascent United States. There were two noteworthy amendments to Jefferson's draft. He had denounced the slave trade fiercely and blamed the home government for interfering with colonial attempts to end it. This was thrown out. So too was the sentence about the British, quote, "We must endeavor to forget our former love for them. We might have been a free and great people together," unquote. Very interesting. On the first point, slavery, we're going to see that obviously rear its head in the 19th century, and this is always a good time with the high school kids to talk about solving your problems before they solve themselves. This is a great example of not doing that, and you end up having a civil war 80 years later because questions in the 18th century were kicked down the road. Solve your problems before they solve themselves. Jefferson says regarding slavery, "Gentlemen, we have a wolf by the ears." We colonists in a state of war and independence with Britain have a wolf by the ears. What is a wolf by the ears? We don't want to be holding the wolf, I mean the wolf being slavery. We don't want to be holding this wolf, and yet we cannot let go. There's nothing we want more than to let go of slavery, and yet we have to hang on, right? Why can't slavery be ended? This will be my final point, and we'll pick up with this tomorrow and boogie woogie into the French Revolution. Again, this is just a survey class, and we're just looking really at the survey section of the project. But if you look at the colonies, as H.G. Wells pointed out earlier in the text, they are all quite diverse, economically, religiously, culturally, ethnically, and you have to play nice. That's very much part of the English system. You have to compromise, and you want these colonies to get on board. So you can't be adamant in things like slavery. You can't really be adamant in many things at this hour. You're trying to get everyone on board, and then you can solve those problems. But you're not going to have an America if half the colonies don't join you. And as it happens, way more than half of those colonies own slaves, North and South. The South obviously has a bigger population of slaves. And so you need to really tiptoe around them when it comes to that topic. Otherwise, you will alienate them, and you will not be able to get them and their support. Fast forwarding, and this is only a survey again. Finally, in this second offensive, Cornwallis's soldiers are caught on the Jamestown Peninsula, and the Continentals seal them in from one side, and the French Navy seals them in from the other, and ultimately Cornwallis must surrender, in which case he is reassigned to India, where he will have a continuing career, although largely forgotten by Americans after Saratoga. And I always remember my high school history teacher pointed out how interesting it was that the British presence in North America began with Jamestown, or should we say, the 13 colonies, because the British obviously still continue to hold Canada until today. But in America, we call America, isn't it interesting? They begin on the James River, and they end. British rule ends at Yorktown on the James River. Always remember that observation of Mrs. Val. I forget what her proper name was, but as a nickname we called her Mrs. Val. Anyway, there we go. We hold these truths. Day 262 of the project. I'm making our way through H.G. Wells' Outline of History. If you want, we have a subpage where you can get all of our poetry and the text, and you can read along with us day by day as this project comes more and more into focus. Eventually, the whole thing will be published in some volumes, probably 3 or 4 fat volumes, and they'll be read secularly on a 1 or 3 year cycle. But anyway, that's it for today. We hold these truths, look at the American Revolution, and I'll catch you tomorrow as we move into the French Revolution. Have a grand and educative day. Bye-bye.